I remember that night as clearly as a photograph I wish I'd never taken, yet can't bring myself to put away. The house was unnervingly silent, the kind of silence that had grown familiar on evenings when worked late, something that had become more routine than exception. I lay sprawled in the vastness of our king-size bed, feeling small against the cool, empty sheets. The glow of the street lamp outside caught on my wedding ring, a faint glimmer in the darkness reminding me of everything I was trying not to think about. 20 years of marriage, and somehow I had learned to sleep alone, even when he was home. The ceiling had become my constant companion those nights, its texture memorized in the darkness above me. I traced the familiar cracks with my eyes, thinking about nothing and everything at once. Down the hall, I could hear faint laughter drifting from the guest room where Jasmine had been staying. Just for a while. She had said when she arrived 3 weeks ago, her divorce papers still fresh and her eyes still carrying that particular kind of exhaustion that comes from rebuilding your life at 40. Jasmine, my childhood best friend who had become a stranger, then suddenly wasn't. She laughed the way she always had, full-bodied and unrestrained, a sound that seemed foreign in our careful, quiet house. I found myself holding my breath sometimes just to hear it better, to remember what it felt like when joy came that easily. I was almost asleep when I heard the soft pad of bare feet on the hardwood floor. My bedroom door, which I always left slightly ajar out of old habit from when the girls were small, pushed open with the gentlest creak. In the dim light, I could make out Jasmine's silhouette, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, wearing what appeared to be nothing but one of my old t-shirts that barely reached her thighs. She said she couldn't sleep alone, her voice soft, a matter-of fact in the darkness. Said she never had been able to, not really. Then she added almost as an afterthought that she never wore clothes to bed either. Hope that was okay. There was something in her tone, playful but not quite joking, that made my chest tighten. I should have said something. Should have reminded her that I was married, that this wasn't appropriate, that Warren could come home any moment, even though we both knew he wouldn't. Instead, I found myself shifting over, making room without speaking, my heart beating so loudly, I was certain she could hear it. The mattress dipped as she slipped under the covers, and I felt the immediate warmth of her body, even though she wasn't touching me. She smelled like lavender soap and something else. Something distinctly her that I remembered from sleepovers when we were 13, and the world felt infinite and terrifying and beautiful all at once. I lay perfectly still, staring at the ceiling again. But now I was hyper-aware of every breath, every small movement beside me. The silence stretched between us, heavy with something I couldn't name and didn't dare examine too closely. This was my friend, I told myself. My childhood friend who needed comfort after her world fell apart. This was nothing more than that, but my body knew what my mind refused to acknowledge. I could feel the heat radiating from her skin, could sense the way her breathing gradually slowed and deepened. When she finally settled into sleep, I remained awake, my eyes wide open in the darkness, knowing that something had shifted irrevocably in the careful architecture of my life. That night marked the beginning at the end of everything I thought I knew about myself, though I wouldn't understand it fully until much later, that moment when Jasmine's warmth entered my cold. Empty bed was the first crack in the wall I had spent decades building around my heart. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of possibility, terrifying and exhilarating and absolutely impossible to ignore. The morning after, I woke alone. Jasmine had slipped back to the guest room sometime before dawn, leaving only the faintest impression on Warren's pillow and that lingering scent of lavender that made my chest tight all over again. I lay there for a moment, wondering if I had imagined it all before the alarm reminded me that life, as always, required my attention. My world had always been built on routine, on the careful orchestration of a life that looked perfect from every angle. At 38, I had mastered the art of seamless days. Coffee at 6, exactly 2 spoonfuls of sugar, cream stirred clockwise 3 times. The newspaper folded just so on the kitchen counter. Breakfast prepared before anyone else stirred. Lunches packed, schedules reviewed. the machinery of our family life humming along without a single missed beat. Our house reflected this same careful curation. Every photograph had its place. Every book aligned perfectly on the built-in shelves. Warren had installed when we first moved here 15 years ago. The living room showcased our life in calculated moments. Family vacations to places with names that sounded impressive at dinner parties. School portraits of our daughters, Haley and Chloe, arranged by year. Warren receiving some corporate recognition I had stopped caring about long ago. It was a beautiful life, I had always told myself, enviable even. But that morning, as I moved through the familiar motions of preparing breakfast, I felt like an actress who had forgotten she was performing, going through the motions of a role that no longer fit. Warren came downstairs at 7:30, exactly as he had every weekday for the past decade. He kissed my cheek with the same distracted affection. He might show a well-behaved pet, poured his coffee, and disappeared behind the financial section. We had become experts at sharing space without actually seeing each other. Our conversations reduced to logistics and schedules. Our marriage transformed into an efficient business partnership focused on the raising of children and the maintenance of suburban respectability. Haley, 17 and perpetually annoyed with the world, barely grunted her good morning before grabbing a piece of toast in her backpack. Chloe, 15 and still occasionally willing to engage with her parents, asked if I could drive her to soccer practice after school. These were the interactions that filled our days now. Practical exchanges that kept the household running, but left my soul feeling increasingly hollow. Then Jasmine appeared in the doorway, and suddenly the kitchen felt different. She wore my old college sweatshirt, the one I hadn't seen in years, and somehow it looked better on her than it ever had on me. Her hair was tousled from sleep, and she moved with the kind of unself-conscious grace that I had forgotten was possible. "Good morning," she said, her voice still soft with sleep, and I felt that same flutter in my chest from the night before. She poured herself coffee and leaned against the counter, completely comfortable in her own skin, seemingly oblivious to the way Warren's eyes followed her movement over the top of his newspaper. Jasmine and I had been inseparable once back when we were young enough to believe the world belonged to us. We had shared everything, clothes, secrets, dreams that seemed both impossible and inevitable. She was going to be a photographer, traveling to distant cities and capturing the beauty she saw everywhere. I was going to write novels, stories about women who lived bold, complicated lives. But then I met Warren during my junior year of college, solid and dependable, and so different from the chaotic warmth of my family home. He offered stability, a clear path forward, the promise of a life that made sense. Jasmine had been skeptical, though she never said so directly. She simply drifted away as my world reorganized itself around wedding planning and house hunting and the thousand small compromises that came with building a conventional life. She had chosen differently, pursuing her art and her freedom with equal passion. She lived in different cities, loved different people, collected experiences instead of things. When she married Gregory 5 years ago, I had been surprised and, if I was honest, a little disappointed. I had expected her to remain forever untethered, and her wedding felt like the closing of some door I hadn't realized I was still hoping might open. Now she was here, newly divorced, and somehow more herself than ever, and her presence in my careful kitchen felt like a stone thrown into still water. She told stories while I cooked, casual mentions of lovers and adventures that made my daughters pause in their morning rush to listen. She talked about cities I had only seen in photographs, described people and places with the kind of vivid detail that made me feel like I was watching a movie of someone else's much more interesting life. When Warren left for work with his usual brief goodbye, Jasmine settled at the kitchen table with her coffee and asked me what I did all day. The question should have been simple, but I found myself struggling to answer. I managed the household, I said, took care of the girls, volunteered at the school sometimes, but what do you do for yourself? She pressed gently, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked me that question. I couldn't remember the last time I had even asked it of myself. That evening, after dinner was cleaned up, and the girls had retreated to. Their rooms, Jasmine opened a bottle of wine and invited me to sit with her on the back porch. She curled up in the wicker chair with her feet tucked under her, completely relaxed, and began telling me about her divorce with the kind of candid honesty that both thrilled and terrified me. She described the slow death of her marriage, the way love could become habit and habit could become prison. She talked about loneliness and desire and the courage it took to admit that the life you had built wasn't the life you wanted. As she spoke, I felt something awakening in my chest. Some long, dormant part of myself stirring to life like a plant finally given water. I found myself watching her mouth as she talked, noticing the way her hands moved when she was passionate about something, remembering what it felt like to be in the presence of someone who lived their life in full color instead of the muted tones I had grown accustomed to. For the first time in years, I felt truly awake, and it was both exhilarating and absolutely terrifying. It began with small things, moments so subtle I might have missed them if I hadn't been paying such careful attention to everything Jasmine did. The way she lingered in doorways when I was cooking, her presence a warm weight I could sense without turning around. The way she posed questions that made me halt mid-sentence, understanding I had no true answers about my own existence. The way she watched me sometimes with a sort of tender interest that made me feel like she was noticing a person I had neglected long ago. The real summons came on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after that initial night she had crept into my room. The children had completed their schoolwork and gone upstairs. William was working late again, and I was at the kitchen sink washing dishes when I heard it. Music drifting down the corridor from the front room. Piano notes. I stopped mid-action. My hands still dipped in bubble water, a dish half cleaned and abandoned. No one had played that piano in ages. We had purchased it when Emma was 8 and showed interest in lessons. But after 6 months of half-hearted practice sessions, it had become just another household object, collecting dirt and holding picture frames I had played once before I was wed, before my hands became too occupied with other tasks to recall the feeling of keys under my fingers. But Lily was playing now, and the tune she chose made my throat ache with familiarity. It was a piece we had played repeatedly during our final year of school, lying across her bedroom floor with hopes pouring out of us like liquid from an overflowing glass, a song about affection and sorrow and the awful beauty of coming of age. I hadn't heard it in 20 years, but every chord was still there in my mind, waiting. I dried my hands on the kitchen cloth and walked toward the sound pulled by something I couldn't identify. Lily sat at the bench with flawless posture, her fingers moving across the keys with a certainty that startled me. She had never been the artistic one between us. I had been the one with music lessons, the one who sang in the school chorus, the one who imagined performing on stages I was too nervous to try out for. She glanced up when I appeared in the doorway, her hands never pausing their motion across the keys. She asked if I recalled the song, and naturally I did. Then she asked me to join in, her voice quiet and hopeful. And suddenly I was 18 again, full of potential and unafraid of my own sound. I told her I hadn't sung in ages, that I wouldn't recall the lyrics, that my voice wasn't what it once was. But she kept playing, and eventually the words returned to me, hesitant at first, then firmer as physical memory took hold. For those few minutes, standing in my own front room, singing a tune from my history, I felt like myself in a way I hadn't in ages. When the song finished, we sat in quiet for a moment, the final notes still suspended in the space between us. Lily closed the piano top gently and said she had always adored hearing me sing, said she questioned why I had quit. I didn't have a reply for her, or perhaps I had too many replies, and none of them seemed sufficient. After that, the summons became more regular and more bold. "Come for a ride with me," she would say after everyone was in bed, swinging car keys like a vow of freedom. "Let's go to the market together," she would propose, turning a common chore into a journey simply by being there. "Let's sit outside." "Tonight," she would murmur, pulling out a throw and 2 glasses of wine, as if she had been arranging it all day. I found myself agreeing more often than I ought to have. We would drive through our silent neighborhood streets with the windows open, Lily's hair flying in the breeze as she told me tales about locations she had visited, hearts she had held. We would walk through the known aisles of the market, and she would indicate things I had never seen, turning the everyday into something wondrous through the simple act of observing it anew. Most perilous of all were the evenings we spent on the rear patio, shrouded in throws, and discussing everything I had taught myself not to consider. She spoke openly about yearning and isolation, about the gap between being solitary and being isolated, about what it meant to live truthfully in a world that praised compliance. She told me about partners she had held and lost, about the way fire could overwhelm you and the way its lack could gradually destroy you. I heard these accounts with a thirst I didn't comprehend, saving every particular like I was gathering proof of a life I might have known if I had been more courageous. She talked about closeness as if it were something holy and untamed, not the planned, mechanical thing that occurred in my marriage bed twice a month if we were both too exhausted to decline it. She described liberty as if it were something you could truly select, not just something you imagined about in the time between sleep and waking. These exchanges left me feeling sore and revealed, as if Lily was raising a glass to desires I had hidden so well I had nearly persuaded myself they weren't real. She never pressured, never requested me to disclose more than I was prepared to offer, but her very existence was a summons to inspect the life I had constructed and question whether it was the life I truly desired. One night, as we sat viewing stars emerge in the fading sky, she told me about the instant she knew her marriage was finished. It wasn't theatrical, she said. It was merely the understanding that she was gradually vanishing inside a life that looked correct from the outside, but felt like silence from within. She described resting next to her husband and feeling utterly solitary, more solitary than she had ever felt on her own. As she spoke, I felt something breaking open inside my heart. Some barrier I had spent years fortifying starting to fall. I recognized myself in her story, saw my own slow disappearance reflected in her words. For the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge that the life I had built, no matter how perfect it appeared, was slowly suffocating the person I used to be. The invitation wasn't a single moment or gesture. It was Jasmine's steady presence in my life, her gentle but persistent knocking on the walls I had built around myself. It was her refusal to let me hide behind the roles I had learned to play. Her insistence on seeing and speaking to the woman I had been before I became someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's idea of who I should be. Night after night, conversation by conversation, she was inviting me back to myself, and I was discovering that I wanted to accept. The changes began so gradually, I almost didn't notice them at first. It started with laughter, the kind of deep, unexpected laughter I hadn't heard from myself in years. Jasmine would make some observation about the absurdity of suburban life, or tell a story about her travels, and suddenly I would find myself doubled over with genuine amusement, tears streaming down my face as I gasped for air. Haley looked at me strangely one evening when I laughed at something Jasmine said about the neighbor's obsession with lawn perfection. "When was the last time you heard me laugh like that?" I asked her later, and she paused, clearly thinking, before admitting she couldn't remember. The realization hit us both with uncomfortable clarity. But it wasn't just the laughter. I found myself paying attention to my own body in ways I hadn't in years, becoming hyper-aware of every accidental touch, every moment of proximity. When Jasmine would reach around me to grab something from the kitchen counter, I would feel the brush of her arm against mine, like an electric current. When she would tuck a strand of my hair behind my ear while we talked, her fingers barely grazing my skin, I would carry the sensation with me for hours afterward, returning to it like touching a bruise. I began to linger in these moments, letting my hand rest against hers a beat too long, when we both reached for the same book, standing closer than necessary when we cooked together, finding excuses to be in the same room, even when there was no practical reason. I told myself it was just friendship, just the natural closeness we had always shared. But my body knew better. My body was waking up after years of sleep, and it recognized something my mind wasn't ready to acknowledge. Late at night, after everyone else was asleep, I started writing again. It began accidentally, really. I had gone downstairs for a glass of water and found myself sitting at the kitchen table with a notebook I hadn't touched in years. Words spilling out of me like water from a broken dam. At first, I wrote about ordinary things, observations about my daily life. But gradually, the writing became more honest, more raw. I wrote about the way Jasmine moved through my house like she belonged there, how her presence made familiar spaces feel new and charged with possibility. I wrote about the growing distance between Warren and me, how we had become strangers, sharing a bed and a mortgage, but little else. I wrote about desire, that word I had barely allowed myself to think, let alone write, describing feelings I didn't fully understand, but could no longer ignore. These midnight writing sessions became sacred to me, stolen hours when I could be completely honest about what was happening inside my heart. I filled pages with questions I was afraid to ask aloud, with observations about the way Jasmine's eyes crinkled when she smiled, with fantasies I was ashamed to acknowledge, even to myself. The notebook became my confessional, the only place I could admit that I was falling in love with my childhood friend, and that this love was changing everything about how I saw myself in my life. The tension between us grew more palpable with each passing day. We would find ourselves in conversation that suddenly stopped mid-sentence, both of us aware that we were approaching territory too dangerous to explore. There were moments when I would catch her looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between tenderness and longing that made my chest tight with want and fear in equal measure. One evening, as we shared a bottle of wine, on the porch, Jasmine reached over and touched the wedding ring I still wore, turning it slowly around my finger as she talked about something else entirely. The gesture was so intimate, so casual, and yet so charged that I felt my breath catch. She didn't mention the ring, didn't ask me why I was letting her touch it, but the moment stretched between us like a held breath before she finally let go. I began to see Warren with new eyes, and what I saw was devastating in its clarity. His indifference, which I had once mistaken for stability, now felt like slow suffocation. The way he looked through me at breakfast, the way he discussed our daughters like they were business investments, the way he touched me with the distracted affection one might show a familiar pet. It all became suddenly unbearable. I started to notice how he never asked about my day, never seemed curious about my thoughts or feelings, never looked at me with anything approaching the interest Jasmine showed in my most mundane observations. 20 years of marriage, and I realized he didn't really know me at all. Worse, I realized I had collaborated in this unknowing, had systematically erased myself to fit into the shape he needed me to be. The contrast with Jasmine was stark and painful. When she listened to me talk, I could see myself reflected in her attention, could feel myself becoming more real, more present, more myself with every conversation. She asked questions that made me think, challenged assumptions I had never examined, saw possibilities in me that I had forgotten existed. Her nearness became like oxygen to me. I found myself timing my daily activities around hers, manufacturing reasons to be in whatever room she occupied, feeling genuinely lost when she left the house for any length of time. When she was away, the air felt thinner somehow, the colors less vivid, as if she had taken some essential element of life with her. I knew what was happening to me, even if I couldn't yet say it aloud. I was falling in love, not just with Jasmine, but with the version of myself that existed in her presence. I was remembering what it felt like to be seen, to be desired, to be worthy of someone's complete attention and affection. After years of feeling invisible in my own life, I was becoming visible again. And the experience was both thrilling and terrifying. But with this awakening came fear, deep and paralyzing. I was a married woman, a mother, someone who had built her entire identity around responsibility and respectability. The feelings growing inside me threatened everything I had worked to create, everything I had told myself I wanted. I was torn between the exhilaration of feeling truly alive for the first time in years and the terror of what it might cost me to honor these feelings. At night, lying in bed next to Warren's sleeping form, I would stare at the ceiling and try to imagine a different life, one where I could follow this pull I felt toward Jasmine without destroying everything else. But I couldn't see a path forward that didn't involve breaking something, whether it was my family or my own heart. The weight of this impossible choice pressed down on me like a physical thing, making sleep elusive and peace impossible to find. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in October, 6 weeks after Jasmine had first appeared at my door with her suitcases and her broken marriage. Warren was in Chicago for a conference. The girls were asleep, and I lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around me. The autumn wind rattled the windows, and somewhere down the hall, I could hear Jasmine moving around in the guest room, restless. I had been expecting her. Over the past weeks, she had slipped into my bed 3 more times, always with some excuse. About not being able to sleep alone, always leaving before dawn, like a secret I wasn't ready to keep in daylight. Each time we lay in careful silence, our bodies aware of each other in ways that made breathing feel dangerous. Each time I told myself it meant nothing beyond friendship and comfort. Each time I knew I was lying. Tonight felt different, though. The air itself seemed charged with something inevitable, as if we had been moving toward this moment since the first night she had crossed the threshold of my bedroom. When I heard her bare feet on the hardwood floor, my heart began to race in a way that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with want. She appeared in my doorway wearing the same old t-shirt of mine, her hair loose around her shoulders, and for a moment, we simply looked at each other across the darkened room. There was a question in her eyes when I wasn't sure I was ready to answer, but I found myself shifting over in the bed anyway, making space for her without speaking. She slipped under the covers beside me, and immediately I felt that familiar warmth, that sense of rightness that both thrilled and terrified me. But this time, instead of the careful distance we had maintained before, she settled closer, her arm brushing against mine, her breathing audible in the darkness. We lay in silence for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. I could feel her presence like electricity, could sense every small movement, every shift in her breathing. The space between us felt both infinite and non-existent, charged with all the things we had been afraid to say. Then, so quietly, I almost thought I had imagined it, she spoke. "Do you ever think about how different life could have been?" She asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "if you'd chosen differently." The question hung in the air between us like a held breath. I knew she wasn't talking about career choices or where to live or any of the safe decisions that shape a life. She was talking about the fundamental choice I had made 20 years ago when I decided that safety was more important than passion, that security was more valuable than authenticity, that the life that looked right from the outside mattered more than the life that felt right from within. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My chest was so tight I could barely breathe. I felt tears gathering behind my closed eyes, hot and unwelcome and absolutely unstoppable. Because the truth was, I thought about it constantly now. I thought about the girl I had been before I learned to be afraid of my own desires. Before I convinced myself that wanting too much was dangerous. Before I chose the path that led to this beautiful, suffocating life. In the darkness, I felt her hand find mine under the sheets, her fingers interlacing with mine with a gentleness that undid something fundamental inside my chest. I should have pulled away, should have reminded used both that I was married, that this was crossing a line we couldn't uncross, that some doors once opened could never be closed again. Instead, I held on. I let my fingers tighten around hers. Let myself feel the warmth of her palm against mine. Let myself acknowledge the rightness of this simple contact in a way I had never been able to acknowledge the rightness of Warren's touch. Her hand in mine felt like coming home to a place I had never allowed myself to visit. The room hummed with something I could no longer deny or dismiss. It was inevitable and terrifying and absolutely true. This thing growing between us. It was bigger than friendship, more dangerous than comfort, more honest than anything I had felt in decades. It was love, though I could barely form the word, even in the privacy of my own mind. This wasn't the confused attraction I had been trying to convince myself it was. This wasn't some midlife crisis or temporary madness brought on by Jasmine's disruption of my carefully ordered world. This was love, real and deep and transformative. The kind of love that changes everything it touches. I was in love with my childhood friend, in love with the woman who had reminded me who I used to be and shown me who I still could become. The realization should have been devastating. Instead, lying there in the dark with her hand in mine, I felt something like peace settle over me for the first time in weeks. The constant tension I had been carrying, the endless internal arguments about what I was feeling and why, all of it quieted to a single clear truth. I loved her. I was in. Love with Jasmine and pretending otherwise was slowly killing something essential inside me. She didn't push for an answer to her question. She simply held my hand in the darkness, her thumb tracing gentle circles on my skin, and let me sit with the enormity of what I was finally allowing myself to understand. We breathed together in the quiet room, our rhythm slowly synchronizing, until I couldn't tell where my breath ended and hers began. When she finally spoke again, her voice was so soft. I felt it more than heard it. "I've been waiting my whole life to come home," she said. And I realized she wasn't talking about a place. She was talking about a person, about this feeling of recognition and rightness that existed between us, about the way we fit together, even in the simple act of holding hands in the dark. I wanted to tell her that I understood, that I felt it. Too, that every moment with her felt like remembering something I had forced myself to forget. I wanted to tell her that I loved her, that I had probably always loved her, that even 20 years of marriage and 2 children and a life built on different choices couldn't change that fundamental truth. But I couldn't form the words. Not yet. So I lay there beside her, our hands intertwined under the covers, and let myself feel the full weight of what I had been denying. This was love, and it was going to change everything, whether I was ready or not. The days following that night felt like walking through a world made of glass, where every step might shatter something irreparable. I moved through my routines, with the same mechanical precision as always, but everything felt different now that I had named what was happening inside me. Love had a weight to it, a presence that colored every interaction, every glance, every moment of silence. Warren noticed first. At breakfast, he looked up from his newspaper and asked if I was feeling well. I was pale, he said, distracted, had been for weeks. I told him I was fine, just tired, but he continued to watch me with the kind of clinical attention he usually reserved for quarterly reports. The irony wasn't lost on me that my husband was finally paying attention to me precisely when I least wanted it. That evening, as I prepared dinner, he cornered me in the kitchen. "You've been different lately," he said, his voice carrying an accusation I wasn't sure he intended. "Distant, like you're somewhere else entirely." He asked if there was something I wanted to talk about, but the question felt more like a demand for reassurance than genuine curiosity about my inner life. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. After 20 years of his indifference, he was suddenly concerned about my emotional availability. I told him I was fine, that I was probably just going through some kind of phase, adjusting to having Jasmine in the house. The mention of her name made something flicker across his face, but he didn't pursue it. Instead, he kissed my forehead with the same perfunctory affection he had shown me for years and retreated to his office. The girls sensed it too, though they couldn't articulate what they were feeling. Haley, always sensitive to the emotional temperature of our house, began spending more time at friends' houses. Chloe asked me directly if Dad and I were getting divorced, her 15-year-old directness cutting through pretense in a way that left me breathless. I assured her we weren't, but the question lingered in the air between us, unanswered and unanswerable. It was Jasmine who brought everything to a head. One morning, over coffee, she mentioned that she had been looking at apartments. Her stay had stretched much longer than either of us had planned, she said, and she didn't want to overstay her welcome. The words felt like a physical blow, even though I had known this moment would come eventually. "I can't stay here forever," she said, and there was something in her voice that made me look up from my coffee. "I'm starting to feel like I'm disrupting something important, like my being here is causing problems I never intended to cause." I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that her presence was the only thing keeping me sane, that the thought of her leaving made something inside me feel like it was dying. Instead, I nodded and said I understood that she needed to rebuild her life, that she couldn't live in my guest room forever. But that night, alone in my bedroom while Warren worked late again, I finally allowed myself to confront what her leaving would mean. I stood in the doorway watching him sleep when he finally came home. His face turned away from me as always, and I realized with devastating clarity that this was my life. This polite indifference, this emotional desert, this slow suffocation, disguised as stability. 20 years of quiet surrender, of making myself smaller and smaller until I had nearly disappeared entirely. The choice wasn't simple. Leaving meant breaking my family, destroying the life my daughters knew, admitting that everything I had built was based on a fundamental lie about who I was and what I needed. But staying meant breaking something else, something essential that I was only just beginning to understand was worth preserving. 2 nights later, I found Jasmine on the back porch, wrapped in a blanket and staring up at the stars. She had been quiet all day, distant in a way that felt like preparation for goodbye. I sat down beside her, and we remained silent for several minutes, both of us aware that we were approaching something we couldn't take back. Finally, I spoke the words I had been rehearsing in my head for days. "I need to tell you something," I said, and my voice sounded strange even to my own ears. Trembling with fear and determination in equal measure, "I'm in love with you." The words hung in the air between us, impossible to take back, changing everything simply by being spoken aloud. I was shaking, terrified of her response, terrified of what I had just admitted, but also flooded with relief at finally telling the truth. She turned to look at me, and I saw tears gathering in her eyes. "I know," she said softly. "I've known for weeks. I've been waiting for you to say it, hoping you would, terrified that you wouldn't." Then she reached for my hand, the same gesture that had undone me that night in my bed, and held it while I cried. Not the gentle tears I had shed in private, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from someplace I had been protecting for decades. I cried for the years I had wasted, for the woman I had been before I learned to be afraid, for the love I had denied myself and her. When I finally stopped crying, she spoke again, her voice gentle but firm. "I don't need you to save me, Eleanor." She said, "I don't need you to rescue me or choose me because you feel sorry for me. What I need is your honesty. I need you to tell me what you want, not what you think you should want, not what would be easier or safer or more acceptable. What do you actually want?" The question cut through all my defenses, all my careful justifications and fears, straight to the core of everything I had been trying to avoid facing. What did I want? Not what was right, not what was responsible, not what would cause the least damage, but what did I actually want? I wanted her. I wanted to wake up next to her every morning to build a life based on truth instead of obligation. To stop pretending that a marriage without love was better than no marriage at all. I wanted to choose passion over security, authenticity, over approval, my own heart over everyone else's expectations. I told her all of this, the words tumbling out of me like water from a broken dam. And when I finished, she smiled through her tears and said she had been waiting 20 years to hear me choose myself. 3 days after my confession, I sit at the kitchen table in the soft gray light of early dawn. A half-written letter spread before me like evidence of a crime I haven't yet committed. The house is silent around me, holding its breath the way houses do when they sense that change is coming, when the careful architecture of daily life is about to shift into something unrecognizable. My wedding ring rests on the wooden table beside. A cup of coffee that went cold hours ago. I had taken it off somewhere around 3 o'clock in the morning when the weight of it began to feel unbearable against my skin. 20 years of marriage reduced to a circle of gold sitting there like a question I'm finally ready to answer. The note is meant for Warren, though I question if I'll ever share it. Some exchanges can't be condensed into written lines. Certain realities demand the complete gravity of being there, of spoken words, and the awful closeness of watching someone's world reshape itself around a changed truth. But I had to write it all the same. Had to see the phrases written down to grasp what I was truly deciding. Upstairs, Jasmine rests in the spare room that has felt more like her own than any place these past weeks. She had kissed my cheek after. We spoke on the steps, a move so gentle it stirred an ache in me, and said she would stay for whatever I chose. No demands, she told me. No deadlines, only the vow that whatever path I took, it would be mine to take willingly. Warren's half of our bed stays perfectly made. He flew to Chicago last evening. Another work meeting in another forgettable town. Another chance for him to sidestep the rising strain within our home that he detects but won't confront openly. His being gone seems like a relief, a pocket of calm where I can at last hear my own mind without the noise of his assumptions. I don't know how the world will reshape itself around the decision I'm reaching. I can't picture the form of what lies ahead. Can't conceive of the talks I'll have to hold with my children, the legal entanglements, the opinions of those. Who will never grasp how a person could leave a stable union for something as elusive as real love? The days ahead seem both frightening and boundless, filled with potentials I've never let myself envision. What I am sure of is this: I cannot keep living a falsehood. I cannot rise each day beside a person who has never truly known me. Cannot keep acting that warm fondness equals love. Cannot keep showing my girls through action that women must be thankful for whatever scraps of care they are given. They ought to witness what it means when a person picks their own soul, picks honesty, picks the harder road toward a genuine existence. The note lies before me, partly done and likely unneeded, filled with reasons and regrets and efforts to clarify something that resists simple reasoning. How do you say to someone that you've realized you've been existing the incorrect life? How do you clarify that love isn't always practical or certain or publicly approved, but that its lack can destroy you gradually, one concession after another? I lift my pen, then place it back down. The phrases seem insufficient, too faint to carry the vastness of what I need to express. Instead, I move the note away and merely sit in the spreading dawn, sensing my breath flow in and out with a calm I haven't known in years. For the first time in 20 years, I am not frightened of my own yearnings. I am not guilty for wishing beyond what I've had, not sorry for craving love that knows me entirely. The burden that had rested on my heart for so long, it turned into part of me, has now dissolved, and I can breathe. Outside the pain, the early sun keeps pouring over the garden, mild and persistent and lovely. Somewhere beyond, I catch the early birds starting their morning calls, and the noise brings me something like optimism. The world is stirring, and so am I. I don't know what follows now. I don't know how to take apart a life I took ages making, how to tell my kids that their mother is picking love over certainty, how to endure the unavoidable criticism and doubt and hurt that will come. What I understand is that I cannot unlearn what I have discovered of myself, cannot unexperience what I have at last let myself embrace. Upstairs, Jasmine dreams. And somewhere in Chicago, Warren joins another seminar that will hold him comfortably away from the reality taking root in his home. The children won't stir for another hour. I have this silent time, this instance of peace before nothing stays. The same, and I feel thankful for it. The morning sun glows brighter, flooding the room with gold.